This is Banfield A. Hall, commonly known as Pete, sometimes Dad, sometimes grandfather, great-grandfather, uncle, great-uncle, and occasionally Dirty Old Man. I don't know how I deserved that moniker, but apparently it crops up now and then, so I guess it'll probably always will. So I have been asked by many how I got the nickname of Pete, since Pete is hardly analogous with Banfield, and the reason for it is that I, as a little boy, probably 2 years old, I loved the story of Peter Rabbit. Dad would hold me on his lap and read it to me almost every day, and I would tease him to read it to me. And I finally just about learned it by heart and could turn the pages at the right place and everything. And one day a story Dad tells, a visiting preacher came, and I went through my routine with Peter Rabbit, and he said, "My goodness, can that child read?" Dad said, "Apparently so." So that's how the name got started. Dad called me Peter Rabbit whenever I would get into mischief, which was seldom, of course. And if you recall the story of Peter Rabbit, he was always getting into mischief with Mr. McGregor. So every time I did, which, as I say, was not often, Dad would call me Peter. He says, "You're just like Peter Rabbit." And so he called me that always whenever I was doing anything out of line. And he was the only one that ever called me that. Until when we lived in Shiloh, one time Jack Ummenauer heard him call me Pete, or Peter. And so he picked it up and he started calling me Pete. And the name stuck, and other people started calling me that, and so it's been Pete ever since. So, inasmuch as I seem to be the oldest one left, I've been asked by some members of the family to tape the history of the Hall family. Consequently, I will endeavor to tell you what I know that has been told to me by my father and mother and others, and as I've seen it and lived it for 82 years. The following was researched for Aunt Prudence to establish her eligibility to join the Daughters of the American Revolution, of which organization she did become a member. It gives the early ancestry of our branch of the Hall family up to my grandfather. Following is the documentary. Christopher C. Hall of Plymouth, Vermont, married Laura Eyre, born in Plymouth July 25th, 1837, died 1929. Laura, born in Plymouth 1852, died in 1892. Christopher was the son of Nathan Hall of Plymouth, who married Prudence Hubbard. He was born in 1800, died December 25th, 1896. He was the son of Nathan Hall of Springfield and Plymouth, born in Mason, New Hampshire, on March 28, 1775, married in Chester, December 5th, 1791, to Ruth Johnson. He was the son of Nathan Hall of Mason and of Springfield, Vermont, born in Pepperell, Massachusetts, August 23, 1745, married Eleanor Bryan, son of Nathan Hall of Pepperell, Massachusetts, Mason, New Hampshire, born in Bradford, Massachusetts, December 25th, 1715, died May 7th, married circa 1742 to Mary Chapman. Bunch of Nathans in the family, weren't there? He was the son of Richard Hall of Bradford, born February 6, 1676, died about 1740. Married intention of April 26, 1715, to Mehitable Barker, son of Richard Hall of Bradford, came from Stratford-on-Avon, Warwickshire, England, about 1672. And it goes on to give a listing of the Johnson family, who seem to be quite prominent in the history of the Hall family. And following is revolutionary ancestry of Hall, certifying admittance to Daughters of American Revolution. Deacon Nathan Hall of Mason, New Hampshire, born at Bradford, Massachusetts, 12/25/1715, died 5/7/1807, furnished horses for soldiers. See New Hampshire Revolutionary Rolls, Volume 2, page 84. Nathan Hall, Jr., born Pepperell, Mass., 8/23/1748, lived Mason, New Hampshire, and Springfield, Vermont. Served in Daniel Emerson's company, Colonel Wingate's regiment, 1776. See New Hampshire Voluntary Rolls. He was discharged at Camp Soldier's Fortune by Colonel Joseph Killey, 11/6/1780. His wife was Eleanor. Nathan Hall, Jr., born at Mason, 3/28/1773, lived Springfield and Plymouth, Vermont. Married at Chester, Vermont, 12/5/1797 to Ruth Johnson. Now that gives you the documentary of the beginnings of our branch of the Hall family. My grandfather, Christopher Columbus Hall, fought in the Civil War, and he was honorably discharged. I don't know whether he had any decorations or not. Some say he did, so I don't know. But anyway, the state of Vermont awarded him a tract of land in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. This tract involved pretty near half a mountain, and of course most of it was wooded, but there was a clearing of sorts on kind of the top of the mountain there, and it was known as a cove. So grandfather cleared that off and built a very nice farm there, nice home and outbuildings and so forth. And they lived there very happily, and of course a lot of work was involved. The timber, of course, on the property was not of much use, since there was no way to transport it out of there economically. They used oxen a lot to haul heavy stuff, and try to use oxen to haul many miles would be out of the question. So they depended on mostly a dairy herd. The land was so rocky that it was not possible to grow money crops, but they could grow what they needed for their own use. So they did have a large herd of Holstein cattle. Well, that became a problem because the transportation to get the milk out was not there. So they had no way to market that milk outside of local sources. So my grandfather and Calvin Coolidge's father, John Coolidge, and a man by the name of Blanchard, and I think a couple others, got together, decided to build a cheese factory in Plymouth Notch. So they built a cheese factory, and were able then to process the milk and get it out in an economical way. And that cheese factory was, of course, always the main source of any business at all in Plymouth Notch. and it is still operating and running, and it is still owned by John Coolidge, the oldest son of Calvin, who, as I understand it, is still living. He's got to be about 94 and still running the plant. But I got to get back now to the ancestry here. Christopher married Laura Eyre, I think sometime in the 1870s, although I'm not sure of my dates here, but it had to be sometime in the 1870s, probably early. So they had quite a few children. Eight, as a matter of fact, Matt being the oldest, then Ida, then Walter, and then Willie, my father, who later changed it to Willow Jasper, and Pansy Bird, and Prudence, who changed it to Prudence later on, Uncle Jimmy, Elwyn, and Lula. Lula only lived to be 12 years old, and we don't know. We know that grandmother died in childbirth, but we don't know whether it was any complication with Lula or not. But anyway, she's buried in the family plot with her mother and father. Of course, grandmother died when Dad was quite young, and his sister Ida, older sister, who was already married and living in Plymouth, took him to raise. And so he lived with her and went to school there in Plymouth Notch. He went to school with Calvin Coolidge. They were in the same class, but Calvin was a few years older than Dad and was a little ahead of him in class. So anyway, he stayed with Lula while he was in lower school, and then he went to live with Uncle Jimmy Ayres. Jim Ayres was the brother-in-law, and he had acquired some property from grandfather, either as a gift or bought it, I don't know which, and it was right up near grandfather's farm and across the road, and he built a nice farm there, and he lived there with Aunt Ella for a long time. And so after grandmother died, Grandpa Chris didn't have much interest in the place anymore, and he kind of let it go to pot, I guess, and so he kind of drifted away from the family. Finally wound up in Plymouth Union, where he married again in later years and raised another family. So I got cousins running around I never heard of, never met. But to get back to the story here, Dad, living with Uncle Jim and helping on the farm, attended Black River Academy in Ludlow. And there is where he met one of his lifelong friends, Ernest Moore. They were very good friends and did lots of things together, went fishing together and so forth. They both liked the brook trout fish. And whenever we'd go back east from Ohio to vacation for a month or so, Dad would always try to arrange to get together with Ernest Moore to go fishing, and occasionally I'd get to tag along, and it was a lot of fun. We'd fish, go up, climb the mountain, and fish the brook down, clear down to the valley. And so we one day, or one year, we went up there. And we went to Ludlow, and Dad wanted to see Ernest Moore, so we went to his law office in Ludlow, and he was there. And he walked in. He was sitting at his desk, and he said, "Well, hello, Will. Have a chair. Want to go fishing tomorrow?" It was just as if he'd just had lunch with him instead of not having seen him for several years. But that's the way Vermonters were. But Ernest was a very successful lawyer and went on to become Attorney General of the state of Vermont, and later on Lieutenant Governor. And he and Dad corresponded most of the rest of their lives, and I think Ernest died quite a few years before Dad did. But anyway, that was Dad's early education. He went then to Black River Academy. Then he went to Colby Academy in Sunapee, New Hampshire. And there he met the Russells, who ran an inn there on Lake Sunapee, and he boarded with them while he was going to school. And to pay his way through school, he preached around in little churches around the countryside and earned his keep that way, and also helping out at the inn. At Colby, he met Jay Chamberlain, who was also another lifelong friend, and the whole family, of course. And Jay persuaded Dad to come to Providence, where Brown University is located, and his family lived, and attend Brown University and live with the Chamberlains. So, which he did. And Dad graduated then from Brown with his divinity degree, and as he had done before, he preached around small churches in the area to earn some money and pay his keep. And then he got his first church. He was called to Wolfboro, New Hampshire, and that starts another phase of the family. But getting back to Plymouth Notch, which I kind of skipped over, Plymouth Notch was up in the mountains, and it was really a picturesque place. It was part of a conglomeration of Plymouths. There was Plymouth Notch and Plymouth Union down in the valley at the foot of the mountain was sort of the hub of it all. And there used to be a Plymouth Kingdom and a Plymouth Five Corners, which have long since been are gone. And on one of our trips east, Dad took me up to see these two little places, which no longer exist. They're back in the woods and back a corduroy road so-called because they laid logs across to make a road. And we drove back in as far as we could and walked the rest of the way. And that was quite an experience driving into that old woods over that corduroy road, where logs all rotted and everything. But anyway, we got back there to these little communities that had been, and of course all that was left was cellar holes, which bears live in now, and occasionally there would be some wildflowers around, hollyhocks, lilacs, and wildflowers that had been planted there by the residents. But no human habitation whatever back in there, and it's sort of weird. It's all grown over, and it's all long gone and forgotten. But Plymouth Notch was a really nice little place, and the Coolidges had a big farm right in Plymouth Notch. that is where Calvin Coolidge was born, and they have a memorial there to him, his birthplace, which is manned by some of my cousins. They kind of run the place, and also there are a lot of cousins working in the cheese factory. But to get back to the Coolidges, Calvin, as you know, was President of the United States at one time, and I recall when he was Vice President, and he was up there vacationing in the Notch, and Harding was President, and he had taken a trip west, I guess a political trip or something. Anyway, he died suddenly out there, and they got the word back by Western Union back to Plymouth Notch, and of course Calvin had to be sworn in immediately. Well, his father was a selectman of Plymouth Notch, and he kind of ran the town anyway, and had been postmaster and everything, and so being an elected official, he had the power to swear in the new president, so he swore his son in as president. And I remember the lines of cars going up there, Secret Service men, and they had big Pierce Arrow limousines. That's what the president party drove in those days. And it was quite impressive. We were summering in Tyson, Vermont, which is just down the road a ways from Plymouth. And we were on Lake Echo, and I'll tell you about that later. Calvin Coolidge had two sons, John and Calvin Jr. Calvin Jr. was just about my age, and he and I used to fish occasionally up on the Coolidge farm. It was a beautiful place to fish because a lot of the trout brooks ran through the meadows where you didn't have trees to contend with, and we had a lot of fun doing that. But Calvin died at an early age, I think about 18. He got a blister in his heel playing tennis in Washington and got blood poisoning and died from it. He's buried up there in Plymouth Notch with his father and mother too, Grace Coolidge. John, as I said before, is still living and operating the cheese factory. This documentary wouldn't be complete without bringing Aunt Prudence into the picture. She's always been a prominent member of this family, and the only aunt we had left on Dad's side. Aunt Prudence, of course, was younger than Dad, and when her mother died, she had to have some place to go. So grandmother's sister, Aunt Ella Reagan, took Aunt Prudence to raise. And Aunt Ella Reagan had married an Irishman, Jim Reagan, who was a railroader, and they owned a hotel in Ludlow called the Ludlow House. So Aunt Prudence worked there as a little girl and helped in the kitchen and helped wait on tables and do a little bit of everything. And Aunt Ella kind of raised her there, and then when Jim Reagan died, she sold the hotel and bought a beautiful house in Ludlow on Pleasant Street. And I can remember that house so well. I loved that house. It was yellow and white trim, and the most beautiful yellow you ever saw. And her living room and dining room and every place was hung with her paintings, which she did so well. And she left a heritage of paintings. I have one of the cats that she did, and most of the children, I think, have at least one. There's one that I always admired that hung in the dining room there that I would dearly love to have of a brace of brook trout, and just a beautiful picture. But anyway, getting back to Aunt Prudence, as she grew up, she went to nursing school, and in Boston, and graduated from there and became a full-fledged registered nurse. And while there, she, working in the hospital, she met Mr. Howard, who was from Ludlow, and was a funeral director and owned a furniture store. So later she married Mr. Howard, and he was quite a bit older than Aunt Prudence, and just after a few years he died and left her his fortune or whatever it was. So after that she tired of just being around the house, so she went to cosmetology school and learned cosmetology. And after she graduated from that, she bought a beauty shop in Bennington, Vermont, and operated that for a while. And there she met Uncle Vaughn, Aldous Vondett, and they were married about 1927. They came to Dayton, and Dad performed the ceremony. And Uncle Vaughn died then just a few years later. They didn't live very long. And so it left her a widow the second time, and she said never again. So anyway, Aunt Prudence continued to live in Bennington until her death a few years ago. I can't remember the exact year, but that is the history of Aunt Prudence. So now you have pretty much the early history of the Hall family. So now we return to Wolfeboro, New Hampshire, where Dad had his first regular pastorate. It was there that he met Mother, Elsie Banfield Peavy Horney. She was born in Farmington, New Hampshire, February the 9th, 1885, to Ernest Peavy and Minnie Banfield. And they lived in Farmington for a while, and Grandpa Peavy was a shoe cutter, fancy shoe cutter, and I guess a pretty good one. And he worked on fancy women's shoes. Probably made a pretty good living at it. But I understand that Grandpa Peavy was a little promiscuous, and I guess things didn't go so well, so Minnie divorced him, and she took Mother to live with her father, Ira Banfield, back in Wolfeboro, which was her home, and they lived there for quite a while. Well, for the duration, I guess. But in the meantime, Minnie married a man by the name of Varning, and I don't remember his first name. But they had two daughters, Aunt Mary and Aunt Edith. So they were really half-sisters of Mother. And Mary and Mother, well, all three of them, I guess, attended Brewster Academy in Wolfeboro, and all did very well in school, I guess. Aunt Mary got a scholarship in music. She was quite musically inclined, and got a scholarship in music at the Boston Conservatory. Now, whether she followed that up or not, I'm not sure, but I think she did. But later became a school teacher, and married a man by the name of Foss. She had 2 sons, Linwood and Richard. Most of you know both of them. They're our first cousins. Aunt Edith never had any children. She married Sherman Rossiter of Worcester, Massachusetts, and lived with the Rossiters. Well, anyway, to get back to the marriage of Minnie and Mr. Varney, he developed tuberculosis, and they had to take him to Arizona, where he when I was so rudely interrupted by the ending of the tape, Minnie returned to live with her father, as mother and the other 2 girls were living still. And she lived there until her death. She developed tuberculosis too, and she died the same year I was born, 1908. So I never saw her. She never saw me. I was talking about Aunt Edith. After her mother died, Aunt Edith went to live with Cousin Helen and Cousin Harry. She was a daughter of Ira Banfield. She took Aunt Edith to raise down in Worcester, and Harry Hissler, her husband, was a wholesale butter and egg dealer, and I guess pretty affluent. And they had a big place up on Lake Winnipesaukee, a big cottage. It was a lodge, really, on the Banfield property up there. And so Aunt Edith used to spend a lot of time up there. Well, she married Sherman Rossiter of Worcester, Massachusetts. Sherm was a stockbroker, and heck of a nice guy, a lot of fun. And he was in the Navy in World War I and World War II both. And he died of, I think, Alzheimer's disease. Aunt Edith, to my knowledge, is still living in a rest home in Sandwich, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod. Now, we haven't heard lately, and we don't know for sure, but we think she's still living, and she'd be about 94. She's 12 years older than I am. So I hope to get up there and find out soon how she is, if she's still there. But to get back to the Banfields, Ira Banfield, Mother's grandfather, was, I guess, pretty affluent. He either owned the bank, was president, or a high officer in the bank there in Wolfboro. And he was a strict old guy, I guess, smoked a pipe and hated cigarettes. In fact, Mom wanted to go with a boy in Wolfboro, and he wouldn't let her go with him because he smoked cigarettes. But anyway, Ira was married to Mary Ann Tolman, and she died about 1871. So he was a widower for a long time. And Minnie, of course, was taking care of the house in return for living there. But I can remember Mother telling about how strict her old grandfather was, that he would hold them down and not let them do anything out of line. But she told about how she and Aunt Mary used to sneak out the back window of the bedroom onto the porch roof and shinny down a tree and go into Wolfboro in the evening after he'd gone to bed, which was quite early in the evening. But I guess they looked after the old gentleman pretty well, and they'd hitch up his horse and buggy for him and get him ready to go anywhere he wanted to go and fix him nice meals. So they probably had a pretty good life there. Then Mother met Dad, and they finally got married in 1906, April 30th, 1906. And Elaine and I were back in Wolfboro in 1970, and as was our wont, we were checking out the antique shops in the area, and we went into one shop in downtown Wolfboro, and there was a little old lady in there, the proprietor of the shop, and we got talking to her, and she said her name was Varney. I said, did you know my mother? Elsie Banfield Varney. And she said, well, I guess I did, but I'm no relation. We just never could figure out that we're any relation. So we went to Brewster Academy together, and I even attended her wedding. And she said, believe me, that was a social event of the year. So I guess Mother was pretty popular in those days, and pretty much had Wolfboro in the palm of her hand. They used to spend all their summers, of course, out at on the lake and at the Banfield properties. They owned 2 islands, Birch Island and can't think of the other one. Anyway, they had these 2 islands. They'd been in the family for years and years, and they had been acquired by squatters' rights. In other words, you build a habitation on there and live in it. You acquire deed to the property for free. So they owned these 2 islands, and they had about a half a mile or more of lakefront on the mainland, Mirror Lake, which was the part of the lake where they were. Lake Winnipesaukee is a beautiful big lake with 365 islands in it. It's 30 miles long and 10 miles wide, and just clearest water you ever saw. And we used to get to spend a few summers up there, a few weeks of the summer, on the islands with our cousins and the Burwells, who were cousins. And I don't know whether any of that property is still in the family name, whether it's still the Banfield name or not, or what has happened to it. We haven't been able to find out anything about it. So anyway, shortly after Mother and Dad were married, Dad got a call to church in Lubec, Maine, where he was to be pastor. He had been in Wolfboro from 1905 to 1907. And he was called Lubec in 1908. Well, I was born September the 7th, 1908, in Lubec, which my recollections are very vague, in as much as I was only about 2 years old or so, or I guess I was about 4 years old when we moved from Lubec. And I can remember the hill and the church and the Pike family who lived next door, they owned the sardine factories, or one of the sardine factories. Lubec in those days was quite a sardine canning town. That was the main interest in the town, business interest. But I can remember the docks and the pilings that would appear so high when the tide was out, in the mud flats. And then when the tide came in, it was almost right up to the deck of the dock. And of course the tide rises and falls about 45 feet there, which in the Bay of Fundy which Lubec is the highest tide in the world. And those are my recollections of up there. But anyway, after I was born, Mother had a friend or an acquaintance or something, and Catherine Doherty of Dover. I guess she met her through Auntie Carrie and Uncle Horace, who I neglected to mention before. Auntie Carrie and Uncle Horace were not aunt and uncle. They were cousins of Mother's mother, Minnie Banfield. But they took a liking to Mom, and she spent a lot of time down there in Dover with them. And they eventually, he was quite affluent. He owned a bank. And they eventually left her considerable money, left Mother considerable money. So Catherine Doherty was a sort of a friend of theirs, I guess, and she was a practical nurse. They called her really a birthing nurse. So she came up to take care of me when I was born, and stayed a few weeks, I guess. And then Ruth was born December 31st, 1910. And Catherine Doherty was there. And I couldn't call her name, so I nicknamed her Dodo. And the name Dodo stuck. So Dodo took care of both of us when we were born, and consequently the rest of the children. But getting back to Lubec, it was a quaint little town, beautiful little town. It was right on the ocean, the most easterly point in the United States. And the Roosevelt family owned Campobello Island, which was just off the coast there. And the family doctor was Dr. E.H. Bennett, their family doctor, and he's the doctor that brought Ruth and I both into the world. And he was there attending Franklin Roosevelt when he was a young man and had polio. And they were spending the summer, had spent the summer up there at Campobello. So we had a pretty good life there, I guess. We had I remember a succession, or Mother telling about a succession of maids. She pretty much always had a maid in those days, and we'd have a whole bunch of different maids, French Canadians who didn't, I guess, weren't too good, and so there was a succession of them. And then they got Tilly, and Tilly they got right off the boat from Scotland, and she could hardly speak any English. As we know it, the Scotch accent and all was different. So Tilly was there until we moved away from Lubec. When we moved to Newmarket, Ontario, her dad took the church up there in 1912. And that was the year that John was born. September the 9th, 1912, and Dodo was there. John was named after John Philip Sousa, the famous band leader who Dad thought an awful lot of, and who had just played a concert at the Toronto Exposition. So we had a lot of fun in Canada, Ruth and I, mainly because we were the oldest. John was just a little baby, and we enjoyed that very much. It was a beautiful big church there. It was a all brick church, and the parsonage was brick, and a big house. And of course, Dad had to build a chicken house there. He had to have a chicken house, and so he built a fairly large chicken house, and he started to raise prize white Orpington chickens. And eventually he organized a poultry show that was held in Toronto. And I guess he won quite a few ribbons with his white Orpingtons down there in the poultry show. And I remember he used to ship eggs all over the country for hatching, and he hatched a lot of baby chicks. He had the incubators and the whole works. And I was just a little young then to clean the roosts and stuff, but I did have to feed the chickens and gather the eggs. I remember that. And I remember there was a tennis court between us and the church, and a long walk down. And Ruth and I used to sit down at the end of that walk and watch people go by. And one Christmas, we both remembered we had the measles, and we were so sick that we didn't want to come downstairs to see the Christmas tree or anything. But they brought us down anyway, and Ruth had gotten a table and chairs and dolls and all kinds of stuff. And I remember I got a cast iron train and a printing set and a whole bunch of stuff. And we just didn't have any interest in it. We were too sick. So Mother took us back up and put us back to bed again, and kind of ruined that Christmas. But we had lots of fun. And in those days, we had to make our own fun. There wasn't no radio, no television, no nothing. We had to invent games and play games, and we had a great time, I'll tell you. We spent 2 summers on Lake Simcoe, which is about 29 miles, 30 miles or so, east of Newmarket. And we'd get up there by traction car. And we were about the same distance from Toronto to the west, to give you an idea where Newmarket was. But anyway, we spent 2 summers up there, living in 2 tents on the shore of Lake Simcoe. Dad had become acquainted with these people. Her name was Purdy. And they owned a farm up there, and it went right down to the lake, and the meadows went right down to the sand. And we were camped right on the shore in 2 tents, and Dad had made beds out of cedar boughs for to sleep on. Did all the cooking out in the open. He built a stone fireplace to cook on, and Aunt Edith was with us one summer, I remember, and she and Mother just had a ball. They would cook out and do their washing in the lake, and they both loved to swim and had a real great time. And Dad had built us a raft. You may have seen pictures of it. and we always flew an American flag on it. And one time, the two guys came by in a canoe and started firing a rifle at the flags and hauled down that yellow banner. And that was during World War I, which Canada was in from the start. They were in it in 1914, and this was about 1915 or so, and the United States wasn't in it, and so they called us a yellow peril to the south. And the attitude toward the United States in those days in Canada was not too good. Because the United States didn't get into the war till 1917. But anyway, we enjoyed our summers there. I recall several times that we had to bundle things up because a thunderstorm was coming up, and run up to the farmhouse, which is about a half mile up a farm lane, to get out of the storm, and because we just had the tents, and they're not too good in a thunderstorm. We had a lot of fun there in those days, and Dad used to commute back into town on the traction to preach on Sunday, and then come back out on Monday. And we were living the life of Riley there. But we had a maid there too in Toronto, in Newmarket. Her name was Flo Verity, and her family was a little, not exactly poor, but not too well off, and she had to work as a young girl, and so she came over, and she was a housemaid, did all the housework, or a lot of the housework, and some of the cooking. Mother did most of the cooking. But Flo was to play a pretty important part of our life later on, as I'll tell you when we get into the later segment of it. So we left Canada then. Dad was called to Franklin, New Hampshire, and we moved to Franklin in 1916, and he took over the church there, the Christian church, beautiful old colonial type white church, and we lived in the parsonage, which was an old house, about 100 years old then when we moved there. The front part of it, that is. The front part consisted of just 4 rooms, 2 down and 2 up. Each one had a big fireplace in it. It was later added on to the rear, and quite a big addition with several bedrooms and a big kitchen and dining room and so forth. And attached on was the proverbial woodshed and barn that you see in New England. And it was there that Franklin, that probably I spent some of the happiest years of my life, and I can vividly recall all of it. Well, Edith was born there July the 12th, 1916, and Dodo was there. Now, Edith was named for Aunt Edith and her grandmother, Laura, Edith Laura Hall. So then in 1918, Bill was born February the 4th, but he was born in the hospital. I don't know whether there were complications or not, that reason for the hospital. But Dodo came anyway, and I remember going over to the hospital, Ruth and I, when we were just little kids, and Mother was there with Bill, and we just didn't like to see him because he had yellow jaundice. So it turned out that mother had so much milk that she was nursing a French-Canadian baby whose mother couldn't nurse it. So she was nursing both the French-Canadian baby and Bill. And Bill looked so terrible with that jaundice that Ruth and I wanted Mom to give him to the French-Canadian woman and keep the French baby, which of course she wouldn't do. But Bill was named for, the Wilbur was for a friend of Dad's named Wilbur Sweat. What connection he had, I don't know, except he was a good friend of Dad's. And of course the James came from Uncle Jimmy. Or Uncle Jim, whichever, I don't know. But anyway, he got well and became a healthy little boy, and we just had a lot of fun. And I remember when John and I used to play together a lot, and we played out in the wintertime. The snow would get pretty deep, and they didn't have facilities to plow, so they rolled it with big wooden rollers weighted down with boulders. Those rollers were about 15, 16 feet long, and they were pulled by 4 horses. And they just roll that snow down, and then, of course, everything practically was horse and sleigh in those days. People didn't get their cars out much, except maybe doctors and people that had to really get around. But when they did, they'd have chains on the back. Of course, they had 28, 30-inch tires on them. And they'd have chains on the back, and they'd take the front wheels off and attach skis to the front axles so that they get around the snow. But anyway, when it would thaw some, these vehicles going by would make pretty deep ruts down the snow, and the water would rush down there like a river. So John and I used to play out there and sail our boats and stuff out there. And he came down sick from that, and we think that was the reason he got pneumonia, and we almost lost him. And he was nip and tuck practically all winter, but he got over it. But I don't think he had his full lung capacity. I'm sure that one lung was damaged in that. And before he got pneumonia, he was a chubby little fella, and after that he never got that back. He was pretty skinny all the rest of his life, but he seemed to survive it all right after a really nip and tuck battle. And our doctor was Dr. Drake, who came every day, 2 or 3 times a day if necessary. And he's the one that brought Ruth and Bill into the world, or Jean and Edith and Bill into the world. And he never charged us anything because Dad was a preacher, so he wouldn't charge the preacher. But to get back to the house in Franklin, it was, as I say, a pretty big house and a great big kitchen. And I remember that big old wood-burning kitchen range. It must have been 10 or 12 feet long. And it had about 6 or 8 burners where you take the top off to get the wood in, and then put it back down and cook on. And on the back of it, it had a water reservoir for heating water. And I guess that must have held 10 or 20 gallons of water. And that was the way we heated our water in the wintertime, and even in the summer if we had a fire in the stove. But usually in the summer, Mother would cook on a kerosene stove, which was out in the woodshed because it was too hot to have the big stove going. But I remember when we had to take our baths, we'd have to haul the water upstairs to the old bathroom, and the old wooden bathtub which was tin lined, and pour the hot water in there. We did have cold running water, but no hot running water. There wasn't any water heater. But in the wintertime, when it get too cold, that bathroom was frigid, and so Mother would get the wash tubs in and put them in the kitchen by the stove, and we'd have our baths there by the stove, so it wasn't quite so warm. But that old baby ate a lot of wood, and it was my job to get the wood in and keep the wood box filled. I remember in the fall, Dad would get 6 or 8 cords of wood. They were in 6-foot lengths, and he'd have it sawed up into stove size, probably about 18 inches, and it made a big pile of wood there in that backyard, believe me. It was my job to come home from school and split that wood and pile it neatly into the woodshed. And that took me quite a while, probably a month, before I got that job done. But I had to do that every fall. And of course, he had lots of chickens, and I had to clean the roots and spread the shit over the raspberries and stuff. And it seemed to be a chore that I always had to do. But even so, we had lots of fun. I used to make what I called a White Mountain shebang. It was a kind of a springboard with wheels on it. I used baby carriage wheels, and I'd made 2 of those, and we used to have a lot of fun with it. I used to play with a fella from Massachusetts who come up and spend the summer with his grandmother down the street. She had a big mansion down there and a big farm, great big barn. And we'd play in the hay mow and just had all kinds of fun. So we each had then a White Mountain shebang, and we'd ride that down the street and all over. But I recall one night the church caught on fire in the middle of the night, one summer night, and remember Dad running up to the church, and it was about a block and a half from the parsonage. And it was fully consumed. I mean, it just burned down. And, well, of course, Ruth and I had to get dressed and run up to the fire. And the time we got up there, it was really at its height. And the church steeple had a bell in it, and that was the fire alarm for that part of town, for Franklin Station, which was part of Franklin we lived in. And all through that fire bell kept ringing until that steeple fell and the fire and the bell came down. And it was pretty weird, I'll tell you. But it did burn the church clear down. So Dad had to rebuild it. And I guess it was quite a chore raising money for it. Finally did. And he built quite a modern edifice there. It was, for its time, it was a little radical maybe, and some people didn't like it, others thought it was great, but it did have great facilities in it. He had a full basement under it, and in the basement he had a stage built with a baptismal tank in the stage, so he could baptize right there in the church. And he had a lot of scenery painted and curtains and the whole bit. So it was quite theatrical when it was converted that way. It had a big folding door that went down the middle of the room that divided it into two halves. And there was a real nice kitchen for cooking, and they'd have all the church suppers in there, but they could divide it up for Sunday school classes and so forth. And then he had on the side, he had some rooms off to the one side, and he had a printing press in there. He did all the printing for the church bulletins and so forth. But the stage was quite a thing there, and Dad had a flair for theatrics, and he loved to direct plays. So he got the young people interested in putting on plays, and he would direct them. And he really built up an interest in the young people and attracted a lot of young people to the church, which he had also done in Newmarket. So it really helped the situation. But they had some pretty nice plays. So then he had one curtain made into a movie screen, and he'd raised some money to get a movie projector. I remember it was a Powers movie projector and had carbon arc lights in it, and had to have a portable fireproof projection booth built so it could be rolled out of the way after a movie. And we used to show movies there during the week, and it was a charge of 10 cents. On Sunday night, of course, it was a religious movie, and that was in lieu of a church service, and it doubled the attendance for evening church service, believe me. Of course, that was free, and lots of people came that weren't even members of the church. But anyway, that was one of the innovations. And I remember I used to help out in the projection booth, rewinding film. And he'd get film from Lasky and Paramount and some of the others. And I remember that because I used to have to go up to the railroad station and pick up the film when it would come in on the train. But that was an innovation which most people weren't used to. But Dad was pretty progressive in spite of some of his Puritan ideas. He was very progressive in a lot of his thinking, and he was a little ahead of his time in some things. But I remember when they were building the church, one time he took me to Boston. We went down on the Boston Main Railroad, went to the North Station in Boston, and of course I'd never been to Boston before, and it was a big thrill for me. But he had to visit some of the places that were furnishing equipment for the new church. And I remember we went into American Seating Company, who were furnishing the pews, and they gave me a desk chair, which they shipped up to our house. And I don't know whatever happened to that desk chair, but it was around for a long time. Then we went into the window place where they were making the stained glass windows, and they gave me a whole handful of jewels that go into the windows, and I prized those no end. And then, of course, we went into where they were casting the bell, and they gave me a brass ingot there. I wish I had that now. I don't know whatever happened to it. But we did have a lot of fun. We stayed overnight at the Parker House, had dinner that night at the Pier 4, which was a big thrill. And then the next morning, he took me on board the Constitution, which was nearby, and it was just a big thrill for me to get to do something like that. And I guess I was lucky. I don't know why he took me, but he did. So, but to get back to Franklin, Franklin is divided into two sections. The river went right through there, right through the middle of it. And the Pemigewasset and the Winnipesaukee rivers joined there, which formed the Merrimack River, which goes all the way down to the end of New Hampshire, down through Concord and Manchester and on down. And across that across that river was a old covered wooden bridge. In fact, Henry Ford had it disassembled and shipped it to Greenfield Village in Michigan, where it was reassembled, and he caused to have built then a new bridge across the river, and it was a steel and concrete bridge, which is now still in use. But that connected the two parts of town. Now, the other part of the town was called Franklin Falls, and the part we were lived in was called Franklin Station. And that's where the trains came in, and the depot was there, and the Boston and Maine Railway ran through there, and also the Northern Railway. And that ran pretty close to the back of our house back there, and we had a big garden in the back, and I can remember we'd go back there and watch the trains come in. And there was a turntable up there. If the trains didn't go all the way through to North Conway, which was the terminus, northern terminus, they'd only go up to Franklin. They'd turn the engine around, and they'd put it on this turntable and turn it around by manpower. And we used to love to watch them do that. And lots of times we'd play on that turntable, and when we weren't supposed to, but we did anyway. But they were just no end of things to do, and as I've said before, we had to make our own play, our own games, and everything else in those days. And I had a friend named Erford Buswell, and we used to trap on the Merrimack River, and we had a lot of fun doing that. Once in a while we'd catch beavers, and once in a while we'd get a skunk. Well, we didn't know what the heck to do with that skunk, so we'd dunk him in the river and pry the trap open with a stick. But we'd catch some beavers, and we'd sell them to an old man that lived up on the other side of the tracks, and he'd give us 50 cents for them, with the beavers, and then he'd skin them and stretch them and dry them, and he shipped them to Chicago, and I think he probably got $5 or $6 a pelt for them, but 50 cents was a big deal to us. And of course, beaver in those days was pretty popular, so he was glad to get all we could catch, which probably wasn't too many, I don't remember. But we had a lot of fun. But Erford died from sugar diabetes shortly after that, and that was the first person that I'd seen dead, I guess. So it probably made an impression on me. Of course, we didn't have any transportation in those days. Dad didn't own a horse or anything, and there were two maiden sisters, fairly old ladies, lived up the street, the Rowell sisters. And they were pretty well-to-do, and they had a big home there that just loaded with antiques. Even in those days, they were antiques. And they had a horse and buggy, and so they let Dad use it whenever he wanted to. And he'd go use it when he had to make his calls, and go, or we wanted to go over to Franklin Falls, which was quite a trek across the bridge and over the river, and so he used that horse and buggy for just running around. And sometimes we'd want to go blueberrying or on a picnic or something. He'd rent from the livery stable a big two-seat wagon with two horses to pull it. And we used to go up to what was called the Great Gaines, which was a meadow up near the Webster homestead, near Webster Lake, and get blueberries and have a picnic. We'd come back just loaded with blueberries. We'd fill all the buckets we had, and then Dad would look around for an old wooden box or something that he could find to fill. He even filled his hat sometimes, because the blueberries were really prolific. It was a burned-over area that had been burned over by a forest fire, and that was where blueberries really flourished. So that was that was the way we entertained ourselves, and probably had more fun than kids do today. But I guess that's enough about Franklin. Dad was offered the job of field secretary for the Christian denomination, whose headquarters were in Dayton. And so he took the job, and in 1920 he had to go to Dayton. And of course there weren't any arrangements for us to move. That was quite a big chore to move everything and get everything ready up there. So he went on ahead, because he had to take his office up there, I guess immediately before he could make arrangements to move the family. So it was spring when he started on that job, and so we were getting ready to move and selling some things off and packing others, and so we finally got everything packed up. But instead of us coming to Dayton, we didn't go immediately. Dad rented a cottage, or an old stone house. Really, it was on Echo Lake, near between Ludlow and Plymouth, a place called Tyson, and it belonged to the Sumners, who I guess he had known a long time ago. And so we went up there and spent the summer there with just Mother and us kids. And then she sent for Flo Verity up in Canada, and had Flo come down to stay with us and help. And so Mom sent her the train fare and everything, so Flo came down and stayed with us. Well, Uncle Walter was, of course, living in Plymouth then, and he hadn't been too well, I guess. He was gassed in World War I, and his health hadn't been too good, so I guess he wasn't working. So he spent quite a lot of time down there with us, and he fell in love with Flo. So they got married later on, and had 2 children, I guess, who are still around. I haven't ever met either one of them, but some of you have, I think. And so we enjoyed that summer no end. John and I used to go down there and fish off the rocks on the water's edge. It was quite rocky, and catch a lot of perch. The water was so clear you could see them down there, and we'd catch them. And every once in a while we'd catch pickerel. And during that summer, John and I built a little shack from old lumber. There was an old barn out behind the house that had fallen down. I guess I don't know whether it was a carriage barn or what it was, but it had fallen down, and the lumber was there. So we used that lumber and built this little shack that I understand stood for many years afterward. And we had lots of fun playing in that. We'd get down there and smoke corn silk and make cigarettes with, of all things, bond paper with corn silk, and sometimes coffee even. And we'd smoke just about anything in those days, I guess. But anyway, we spent that summer there. Then we had to move to Dayton. Dad had found a house, a rented house on 33 Gordon Avenue on the west side. And we had our furniture, of course, had to be shipped by freight. Took a whole freight car. And that took quite a while to get there. In fact, we got there before the furniture did. And I remember that we had to take the train from, I think, Ludlow. We had to go to Ludlow to get the train, and we went into Buffalo and had to change trains. And here was Mother with 5 children, one Bill, just kind of a toddler, and she was pregnant then with Jean, I think, if I remember right. And so I remember Dad had made arrangements all the way along, and they had a porter meet us. We had to change trains in Buffalo, and we went up on the New York Central, and we had to change to the Erie to come to Dayton. So he'd had wired ahead and arranged for a porter to meet us and help Mother get on the other train. And I remember this porter coming up, "You the lady with 5 children for Dayton?" She was pretty relieved, and so was I, because it was my chore to take care of, see to Ruth and John, and Edith and Bill were Mom kind of took them over. So anyway, we got there we got her on the train, and it was a sleeper, and we had a bedroom, I think, or a stateroom. Probably a stateroom. And we got to Dayton. Dad had gone into Springfield on the train to meet us, and he got on our train at Springfield, so that helped a lot when we got to Dayton. But we didn't have any furniture then, because it was en route by slow freight. So we went to stay with the Dennison family, Reverend Dennison, who was a big wheel in the Christian church. I guess he was probably Dad's boss, I don't know. Anyway, we lived there for a week or so before our furniture got here and we could move into the Gordon Avenue, where we lived for a couple of years. And it was near the First Christian Church, so we attended the First Christian Church, of course. And Dad had to do a lot of traveling. Part of his job was to raise money for the denomination, so he was gone a lot. I remember one time he got, I think it was in Missouri, he got a puppy and had this puppy shipped by express to us, and it was a little fox terrier, and had a big spot on his back, and we called him Spot. And we had old Spot for quite a long time. In fact, we moved to Shiloh while Spot went with us. He was a real pet. It was at Gordon Avenue that we got our first phonograph. It was a Brunswick phonograph, and we played records on it, and I remember what a big thrill that was to have that, because there wasn't radio or anything like that then. At least it wasn't available to the general public. So we played records, and Mom would get us new records, and we'd get a big thrill out of that. And John became enamored with it. He just loved that phonograph, and he learned those records word for word. and we really had fun. And it was there that Gene was born, September the 6th, 1921. And Dodo was there. Mother sent her train fare to come out there, and so she came and took care of Gene. And Gene was named, of all things, from a phonograph record. We had a record by Harry Lauder of My Bonnie Bonnie Jean was the name of it. And Dad was quite enamored with that record, so he named her Jean. And then, of course, the Prudence came from Aunt Prudence. But she was a cute little girl, and everybody was, of course, babied her something terrible because she was the youngest, and we all thought she was so beautiful. Then later in 1921 or 22, I'm not sure. It was late 21 or early 22. Dad got kind of tired of traveling all the time and asked if he couldn't have a church. So the pastorate at Shiloh was vacant, so they gave him that church. And the church is not there anymore. The new church is across the street from it. The old church is where the cemetery is expanded to. The cemetery was back of it all the time, but that church is gone. So we moved out there, and the parsonage was just down on Wampler Road, which is now Philadelphia Drive, a block from the church. And of course, one of the first things Dad had to do was build a big, long chicken house. And he had a bunch of chickens, mostly white leghorns, because they laid better than the others. But he had some other kinds, Plymouth Rocks and Rhode Island Reds and so forth. And he had a great big Rhode Island Red rooster and a big Plymouth Rock rooster, and they used to fight, and he'd keep them separated. And every once in a while, I'd let them in together, and boy, they'd put on a battle. It was kind of bloody at times. Of course, I'd catch hell for that, but I used to do it. And of course, I had to clean out the roosts, and that was a big chore because that was a big chicken house. And I'd have to clean the manure out and spread it around. So maybe that's how I learned to spread it. I don't know. Maybe that's how I became a salesman. Anyhow, that was a good time up there. Ruth and I went to Fairview High School from there, but first I was in the 8th grade, and I think she was in the 6th. And she went to Shiloh School, but I had to go down to Forest Park School, and they didn't have any school buses running down there from Shiloh, so they gave us passes on the traction car, so we'd have to ride the traction car down there, which is right at Forest Park. And I went there for the 7th and 8th grades. And then Ruth and John and Edith went to school at the Shiloh School. And the old school is still standing there. There was a round school. And then, well, Dad was president of the school board. He was president of Harrison Township School Board. They built these new schools. They built one in Shiloh and one on Fairview Avenue and one in Westwood. And so then they went to that new school. And then Ruth and I went to Fairview when we got into high school, and we had school buses then that took us over. They were run by St. John. I remember they were just old school buses. They were painted black, and they were most uncomfortable, but they got us there and back. We were kind of growing up then, and had lots of things to do, and my best friend was Jack Ummenauer, who lived right across the street. The old Ummenauer home was quite an old mansion, and had a barn and a carriage barn down there, and we used to play down there and have a lot of fun. And I remember Jack's uncle, or brother, or father, I'll get it, his brother-in-law, really, Nell's husband, gave us an old Dodge Coupe, 1917 Dodge Coupe. And we used to run all over the countryside in that. It ran pretty well. I don't suppose it ever had over 3 gallons of gas in it all the time we had it. But we really had a lot of fun with that old Dodge Coupe. And one day a door fell off. Just, I guess, too rusted or something to stay on, so it fell off. So we didn't know how to fix that, so we decided to put a screen door on it since it was summer. And so we fashioned a screen door for it, and it was an old wooden body, and it curved, so we had to steam that wood so we could curve it to the body. And we made a fairly successful screen door for the thing, and then one day it was parked up under the porte-cochere there, which was kind of a hill down the hill, and we didn't have the emergency brake set or something, and it rolled back down the hill, and the other door came open, the driver's side, and hit a tree and knocked it off. So we had to build another screen door for that. And so we painted the whole thing white then, because screen doors were pretty conspicuous. So we drove that around all that summer with those screen doors on it, and just had a ball. But I had a girlfriend, Myrtle Fink. She had a pony, and we used to ride around in that, and go up Shallow Springs Road and all over. Shallow Springs Road in those days was a gravel road, as was Wampler Road. Just gravel and tarred over. And of course now it's pretty well paved. We drove the old Dodge over all the roads around there, Little York and Dogleg and all that, Frederick Pike and all those roads. Of course, then you didn't have to have a driver's license. You didn't have to worry about insurance. And it wasn't until, like some years later, you had to have a driver's license. Then it cost 50 cents, and you could just go in and give 50 cents and get a driver's license. No tests or anything else. So there wasn't much to it. But anyway, we graduated from high school there. I graduated in 27 and Ruth in 29 at Fairview. We had still never gotten a car. So one year, I think it was about 1924 probably, the church secretly raised some money. They raised about $500. And they had all this money tied to a little toy tin car, and had a special meeting at the church to present this to Dad with all this money tied to it with ribbons, hoping that he'd buy a Model T Ford, I guess, because Model T Ford then sold for about $480, Model T touring car. But Dad wasn't going to settle for a Model T Ford. I guess he thought that was a little beneath him, I don't know. So he persuaded Mom to kick in some more money and bought an Oakland. I think it was a 25 Oakland. It's a General Motors car then. And it was a touring car that had curtains on put on the side, had disc wheels, four-wheel brakes. It was about the latest thing in automobiles, and we drove that around a lot. And we used to go east every summer, and we'd get the car all polished up and shined up, and Dad had made a box that went all along the right-hand side of the car, fastened to the running board, and that carried all our bedding and clothing and things like that. And then on the back, had a luggage rack fastened on the back, and we had our tents. We had a tent and folding cots, army cots that we'd pile on there, plus maybe a couple of suitcases. And on the left-hand side, just in front of the driver's door, extended up the front fender, he'd made a little box that held a Coleman stove and cooking utensils and all the stuff we need to cook. So we'd go east and we'd travel. I remember we'd get maybe as far as Worcester, Ohio the first day. The speed limit then was about 35 miles an hour, and Dad wouldn't drive much over 35. And so when I'd get the driveway, I'd try to kick it up a little faster if he was dozing off, but he'd catch me and make me slow down. So we'd get maybe as far as Worcester the first night. We'd have to stop somewhere along some farm, and he'd go up and see if farmer would let us camp in his meadow, and usually they would. And so we'd have to pitch the tent, set up the cots and everything, and Mom would get supper. We'd get milk and butter from the farmer, and she cooked on that Coleman stove, and we had a little folding table set up and some camp stools. I don't know how we got all that stuff on that old Oakland, but we did. So I think we probably had to camp out 2 nights before we get to Vermont. And we'd go up there and stay at Uncle Jimmy's usually, and go fishing and all kinds of stuff up there. We had a ball doing that. And one year the Murrs went with us. Byron Murr was an attorney, very fine man, and very good friend of Dad's, and well, of the whole family. He was superintendent of the Sunday school at the church. So one year we took them. They decided they were going to go with us. They had a Nash, and remember the seats and that folded down so they could make a bed so they could sleep in there. And Lowell and Miriam were just little children then. And Mrs. Wampler went with them. She was Anna Wampler. She was a lot of fun. And she went with the Murrs. So one year they went with us, and we had a lot of fun up there. The 2 families. But I don't know how many times we took that trip, but 3 or 4 times. And those are the things that made Shiloh fun too. But finally, after we were growing up then, and Dad finally got a call he was supposed to start a new church in Dayton View, as I understood it, and he was to raise the money for it. Now this was in about 1926. So he left the church, and Faley Meadows came in as minister there. Incidentally, Faley Meadows had followed him in Newmarket, and he stayed there for a long time. But anyway, we moved from there, and they bought a house at 2801 Harvard Boulevard, new house. and I think Mom used up most of the rest of her money on that for down payment and stuff, because things got a little bad after that. I mean, I don't know how much Dad was making on this new job, but anyway, when we'd moved there, and in the interim, the church, Christian denomination, merged with the Congregational denomination. And he was very much opposed to that. Dad was. He didn't like any part of it. So he just quit. It's cold turkey, just quit. So he was not doing anything, and the money was a little scarce. And so I guess we had to sell the house or traded it or something to a realtor named Mr. Fox. Dad had gone to work for him selling real estate. And so he traded us that house for one on Catalpa Drive. Don't remember the number, but it was up on Catalpa. And that's where Byron was born. And he was born January of 1926. Well, Dodo wasn't there this time. Dodo had died. So Byron was born in the hospital. I think it was probably, yeah, I'm sure it was Miami Valley. And Byron was named after Byron Murr, who, as I said, was a great friend of the family. But the Craig came from a strange place. It was, Dad had known a minister by the name of Craig that he went to divinity school with, and he admired a whole lot. And so, casting around for a name, he came up with that, and that's how Byron got his name, Byron Craig. And we lived there on Catalpa for, I don't know, several years, and then moved around from there, moved over on the west side, and all over, and finally on Grand Avenue. And we were feeling the effects of the Depression, which was at its height right then, 1929 to about 1933, I guess. So we actually had to go on relief after a while. Mom's money had run out, and Dad wasn't able to make a living at real estate, and so he finally took a job at Inland Manufacturing, running the tool crib there, where he got a steady income from. In the meantime, then, Mother had gotten work by going out and doing nursing. She would work for people who had new babies and take care of the babies and help around the house somewhat, but mostly just the nursing. And she worked for people like Dave Reich, Dr. Kuhlman, and some real nice families. So that brought in a little extra income. We wound up then on Grand Avenue in a big old house there that was quite old brick house. And then from there moved to a half a double just down the street, about 4 or 5 doors down the street toward Salem Avenue, and lived there for a couple of years, I guess. Then Dad got a group together, and they bought some acreage out on Union Schoolhouse Road. It was part of a farm, and they, I guess, bought it real cheap. So they divided that up. They divided into 3-acre plots, and each family that was involved got 3 acres to build on. And then the ones that hadn't been in it, they sold them. They had formed an association, called it the Highland Association, and so that was called the Highland Plat. They built a road up through it, just a gravel road. They used just build the road with scrapers and gravel, and that was Highland Avenue. So Dad built a structure out there to live in, and give you 3 guesses what it was a chicken house. And the family lived in that until the big house was done, which was done in stages, and practically the whole family worked on it at times, and Dad worked on it all the time. And he's established quite a place there. But this is about where you guys came in, and you probably know the whole story from there on, so I'll terminate this little boring little lecture and let you take it from there. But in passing, we've got to remember and recognize those who have passed on. It was Mother in 1969, Dad in 1971, Bill in 1978, Jim in 1980, Byron in 84, Sid in 1985, John in 1987, my wife Elaine, 1988, and Ruth, of course, in just this year, in May of 91. 4 of those died of cancer. It's a terrible, dread disease, and I hate it. But life goes on. We've all got to live our own lives. So keep your chins up. Try to do something nice for somebody. So long.